Well, good evening. I want to give you another update here on dangerous Hurricane Dorian. Of course, it was extremely dangerous at one point, a Category 5. Now it's, quote, only a Category 2. That is still enough to do a lot of damage. You can notice some changes, even if you're not a professional meteorologist. We had a really small, really well-defined eye early, and then as the storm moved to the north, finally started getting some wind shear on it. That's basically just the jet stream, or the edges of it, pulling and tugging on it, and it disrupts the system. So that eye, now very broad. Think of it, I mentioned it earlier, it's like an ice skater in the Olympics. When they spin around and they're very broad, you know, with their arms out, they spin at one speed. When they bring the arms in, they spin faster and faster. Same thing with a hurricane. It's all simply the laws of inertia. So what we're talking about here, an angular momentum. So essentially, the storm now weaker because it is spreading out, but that'll play an important role later here in the forecast. So Wednesday afternoon, 110 miles per hour in terms of the sustained winds east of Jacksonville, pretty close to the coastline though. Same thing here as it gets east of the Savannah area and Georgia area. Then it gets up even closer, maybe even touching the coastline here at some point over South Carolina. A gradual weakening as that shear continues, and then moving very close here to the Outer Banks. Might be a little bit north, might be a little bit south. We'd have some variations in our weather depending on that track and whether it is offshore 30 or 40 miles or up over the Sounds by 20 or 30 miles. But in general, we are going to be looking at some effects that we will talk about. By Friday afternoon, it is east of Cape Hatteras and continuing to move as a Category 1, eventually transitioning to a hybrid storm to the north. Now, the difference in the American model in yellow and the red, which is the European model, isn't so much in the track. The tracks are really, really similar. It's in the speed of the system and the timing, really, as it gets here. So here you can see the red and pretty much the same thing. Everything is obviously, it's hard to see the yellow, but it is centered within that same general area as we are into Wednesday afternoon and evening. It's probably a little hard to see, but the center of the yellow's up here just south of Charleston, whereas in the red, it's a few miles behind. So in other words, the European model, just a little bit slower, but both of them have it right near the coastline, and then they both move it parallel to the coastline. Now the GFS, or the American model, is getting a little bit out ahead of the European model, or the ECMWF. But again, it's along the same line exactly. It's just a difference in the arrival time. Here it is over Cape Hatteras, and then watch the red right over Cape Hatteras, just a few hours different. So maybe a 6 to 8 hour difference in terms of the times. That's why the National Hurricane Center is currently averaging those two out, and that's where they're getting the time frame that they predict the storm. Some other systems out there in terms of models all bring it here off the coastline of South and North Carolina. But again, there is a little bit of a difference as to exactly what the main threats will be because of the exact position of the center. Closer to the land, the worse things get for areas on land. But in general, here are the threats from Dorian for Virginia. The wind will be a moderate threat, storm surges and tides a moderate threat. Rain, a moderate threat. Tornadoes, non-existent. For North Carolina, rain, a significant threat. Tides and surge, a significant threat. And the wind, a significant threat as well. So let's talk about the rain. A lot of people comparing this storm to Matthew just 3 years ago. 3 years and about 1 month exactly. That storm brought 6 to 12 inches of rain, depending on your exact location. And we had tremendous flooding from it. Places that have never flooded before because we've never had a really wet lead up to a storm that dumped that much rain. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. But here's the European model. Again, slight differences in where they have the heaviest rain. The two main models, this is 10 or more inches, 10 to even 15 or more, down across eastern North Carolina. Here we are in the reds heading over toward browns. That would be 2 to 5 inches for Hampton Roads. Pretty quick drop off when you get north and west. Now the American model. Again, pretty similar numbers, just shifted ever so slightly. This brown over to sort of purple area would be 5 to about 8 or 9 inches of rain. And then from parts of south side back toward the peninsula, you'd have the 2 to 5 inches there, and then dropping off very, very quickly as you got up a little closer to the peninsula and Williamsburg. So comparing Matthew versus Dorian, let's say they get equal amounts of rain. It's not going to end up with the same amount of flooding, and here's why. When Matthew struck, from June of that year until its arrival, the first week of October, we were 14 inches of rain above normal. That is 3 months of extra rain, or 4 months of extra rain, crammed into the same time frame. So it was extremely wet just the week before, which is part of this number. The prior month, we were 9 inches above normal with the rain. A lot of that coming from what had been Hurricane Hermine. So we were already laying the groundwork with a totally saturated situation, nowhere for the water to go. In this case, Dorian, from the June arrival of summer until the arrival of the storm, we're only 2 inches above normal. It has been a little bit wet, and it's all really in the previous month. For August, we were 2.05 inches above normal. So that's why even the same amount of rain won't cause the same type of flooding, the freshwater flooding that is, in areas or, Kempsville and over toward Windsor Woods and all the places that got the freshwater flooding would not be the same. Here's the timeline. Dorian, Thursday morning, so a day and a half from now, will be near the South Carolina coast, maybe even on the South Carolina coast. It'll be a little breezy around here. 10, 15 miles per hour, a little windy for the Outer Banks at that point, 20, 25, 30 miles per hour at the most. By Thursday night, overnight though, Dorian moves up to near Wilmington, North Carolina. Heavy rain for much of the area and moderate tidal flooding. Moderate tidal flooding starts at 5.5 feet above a low tide. So again, the very lowest end of the moderate flooding. Winds for Outer Banks, southern Outer Banks, that is, down near Hatteras, places down there, 50 to 70, gusting to 90 by morning. Not so much Thursday early overnight, but Thursday late in the overnight, really into early morning hours Friday. We'd see some gusts maybe up near 90 miles per hour. 20 to 40 for Hampton Roads with some gusts to 50. And then from Hampton Roads down through the central Outer Banks, sort of in between, let's say 30 to 50 with some gusts up to 60 or 65, something like that. Friday morning, Dorian should be near Cape Hatteras. We will have heavy rain. In terms of tidal flooding, still only moderate because we'll be at a low tide at that point. So even though the water levels will be coming up, we'll be counteracting that with the fact that we're at a low tide, so it'll still be about moderate. Winds of 50 to 80 miles per hour sustained, gusting to 90 for the southern Outer Banks. 30 to 50 mile per hour winds gusting to 60 for Hampton Roads. Again, this is depending on the exact timing, but what we're thinking now is that then Friday afternoon, Dorian will be northeast of Hatteras. That'll cause major sound-side flooding in places like Manteo and Collington, some of those locations. Northwest winds here locally actually pretty much everywhere, 50 to 70, and a few gusts to 8. Oh, excuse me, this is the Outer Banks. I thought that didn't sound right. So this is Friday afternoon. We had everybody lumped together. Now we're just going to separate them out. In the Outer Banks, winds of 50 to 70, gusting to 80 plus as that storm moves away. That northwest wind will really be howling. Friday afternoon in Virginia, same position, northeast of Hatteras, but our winds 35 to 55 with some gusts to 60 plus, especially near the coastline. That'll cause moderate flooding. Maybe the low end of major starts at 6.5 feet above mean lower low water, or above a low tide, in other words, and we'll talk more about that and how that compares in just a second. Friday night, Dorian's way offshore, westerly winds at 15 to 30, gusting to 40, and still some moderate tidal flooding. There is the system, again, working its way to the north and continuing that spread as we had just talked about. Oh, I actually wanted to show, well, what I was going to show was the historic tides, and I thought I had put that in there. Isabel was 7.8 7.8 roughly, or 7.9, actually 7.9 I think it was, feet above an average of the lowest of the tides. So total water in the basin, every day at high tide, we get a foot or 2 to 3 feet in the basin. Well, you had almost 8 feet with Isabel, 7.8 I think it was, or 7.8 something. Now, with Bonnie, with Hermine, we had around 6 feet. With the storm that's upcoming, we're predicting from around 6 to 6.5. So at 6.5, that would be a foot to a foot and a half below Isabel, even more than that. It would be below Irene by a good foot and a half, something like that. So that gives you sort of a comparison. I'll put that chart on the 11 o'clock news when I talk about it. But for now, that is the very latest update on Dorian.